I'd like to introduce Mr. J.B. Daniel. J.B. is a grazing specialist and grassland agronomist in Virginia, and over the last 13 years he's worked to develop training programs and opportunities to maintain a highly knowledgeable and competent conservation field staff. And he actively partners with local, regional, and state specialists and organizations to conduct pasture walks, grazing schools, practice field demonstrations to transfer knowledge of sound principles and management techniques to producers and conservation staff for improved pasture and grazing management and soil health. So, without further ado, JB.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And you're very welcome. It's great to be here with everybody today. And we'll go ahead and get started. I'm filling in today for Dr. Katie Payne, who was the lead and was going to be here and present a summary of the establishment of native warm season grasses and mixture in Southside, Virginia. It's a project she had going on. I'm very familiar with the project, so I was glad to be able to step in and cover for this. Just to give you a little background, up until about 5 years ago, I'd say there was, on average, very few livestock producers that were actively looking to plant native warm season grasses as forage on their farms in Virginia. And there's some reasons for that, but it just really bothered me, or it confused me as to why more people were not open to the concept. Because 5 out of 10 years, we ended up with significant periods of drought in one region or another of our state, and you end up with pasture situations like this that you see here, where all the available forage is gone, and the cattle are just struggling to get through this summer slump, and you know, continuing to do the same thing year in and year out and expecting a different outcome, right? That's the definition of insanity, they say. But there is an alternative. And, but in general, nobody had really looked at doing much of that. And, you know, when I came through Virginia Tech as a student, there was a professor there and a researcher, Dr. Dale Wolf, and he had done some work with switchgrass, and he had promoted switchgrass both as a forage crop and as biofuels, but he had just retired there in the mid-90s, and I was a student, and I graduated just after that and went into work with cooperative extension at that time. And I was just a young professional trying to soak up as much information and learn and just kind of get my footing, and none of the extension specialists at that time were really promoting any of the natives as an alternative forage for just a portion of the grazing lands in a system. None of them were. So I didn't really think much about it and just went on with the program and continued. And at that time, like from then, fast forward in the next 15 years, most of the native warm season grass plantings that you would see were focused specifically and only on wildlife areas. Okay, so I think some of the negative connotation that developed in the farm community when thinking about establishing natives for forage is that they would see a wildlife planting and it would look kind of like the picture here on the screen. It would be very thin, very weedy. You think, well, this isn't a thick, productive forage stand. And then they would talk to their neighbor and say, well, when did you seed that? And he's like, 5 years ago. Okay, and you know, if you're going to wait 3 to 5 years and end up with something like that, then that discourages anybody from trying it, right? But there were some reasons, it turns out, that you came up with something like this, because this is probably really good habitat for a lot of the wildlife, the ground nesting birds, right? But it doesn't meet the needs of a producer who's trying to put pounds on calves or maintain their cow herd during the summer. But oftentimes, if it was just a wildlife planting, it was set-aside area, it was a buffer, or this odd little shaped field, and some wildlife funding was available to just plant that and not have to fight trying to plant a crop and harvest in this irregular little field or on a buffer and so forth. And with that wildlife funding, the land could not be used for production anymore. It had to be set aside specifically for the purpose of wildlife. So it really limited the number of acres that were established that way. In doing so, some of the stands failed or were very slow to establish, like the one here on the screen, because there wasn't a lot of emphasis and money put into preparing the site to get a really good stand. Because for wildlife, you can allow a lot more weeds, a lot more competition, and can be a lot slower to develop. So that, I think, shaped a lot of the paradigm over 15 years. And then it was about 5 years ago, there was a gentleman from Southwest Virginia, and he'd been talking to me. He said, I really want to establish some natives. I saw it on a tour when I was down south. I really want to do it. And most of the specialists would tell him that your climate and your growing season in the summer is so short, and you probably won't get a lot of return out of it. But he was determined to do it. He went ahead and did it on his own, and he was very successful with it. Okay, and I was really impressed with what he accomplished. And then I started talking to Dr. Pat Kaiser. Many of you have met him here this week, and really learned all about more of the research that he'd done as it relates specifically to production and the benefits of production. And he said, we know with his new establishment method, or a focused establishment method, he's really refined the process where he could help most producers have a pretty, like a 85% success rate in establishing in 1 year. So if you can move from the mindset of, oh, it's going to take me 3 years, to having a high rate of success in establishing in one growing season, then that's a big switch. So it got my attention. And when you couple that with the positives that you get out of the native grasses once you get them established, and what it means to diversifying the forage base, to really providing that fresh, nutritious, bountiful forage available for your grazing animals during the summer slump that we suffer in Virginia, then it just complements our grazing systems very well, right, on paper. Lower fertility requirements, it builds resiliency into the production system, it limits your risks of running out of feed, and it doubles for having a lot of benefit to wildlife if you're interested in the wildlife aspect. So all of this together, it inspired a conservation innovation grant at the state level in Virginia through NRCS. And at the time, Dr. Gabe Pent was at the Southern Piedmont Research Center, and he put in a proposal for a CIG. He was awarded that CIG, and one portion of that focused on planting a 16-acre field, or transitioning it from a fescue mix to native warm season grass mix at the Southern Piedmont Research Center in Blackstone, Virginia. And that happened to be about 30 minutes from my office. So I was able to follow and track this project pretty closely. And that was one main objective of it. So this is where we're located in the state. It's kind of the heart of the Southern Piedmont. And you see a group of calves there, or steers there at the Southern Piedmont Center prior to this. And that just gives you a little bit of framing up the situation there. And what the goal was, they decided to put it in the mix, the big bluestem Indiangrass, little bluestem. So in the fall of 2018, it went in and burnt the fescue stand down in late October with 2 quarts per acre of glyphosate. And they followed that by seeding just cereal rye as a cover crop for the winter. Over the course of the winter, Dr. Pent was hired in a new position in the Shenandoah Valley. He moved away from the station. The rye grew out the next spring, but there was nobody there to manage the project in 2019 when they had originally planned to plant the native grasses. So they just put it on hold, okay? Normally they would have planted in the spring of 2019. They put it on hold. That year they hired Dr. Katie Payne, and she came in and she kind of took over in the fall with this project. So what they did in 2019, they grazed the rye and then just let it fallow. They took care of, sprayed some perennial weeds, and then, or clipped it and sprayed it later that summer. And then in the fall of 2019, they went in and burnt down all the weeds that had come in again, added some remedy to knock out some of the broadleafs and some woodies that were coming in. And then they followed that with 60 pounds per acre of just barley, right? That was just to hold the soil together over the winter until we got to the planting window that we were targeting of March. So that was a mid-October seeding. It overwintered, and you can see in this picture right here, this represents the cover crop in mid-February of 2020. So at that time, they went in and sprayed later that day after the picture was taken, just a pint and a half of glyphosate, because the stuff was tillering a little bit, but it wasn't bushing out, wasn't starting to grow a whole lot. We wanted to go on and stop that growth, have it wither down a little bit to limit the amount of biomass or residue that's on the surface so we could get a good, consistent seed placement very shallow at the surface. And that's how they did that. And then, just 3 weeks later, they targeted the seeding date, ended up being March 17th. And the field crew there, they mixed the seed. We had a mixture of big bluestem. We used Niagara big bluestem. It was in a Georgia ecotype of Indiangrass. The big blue was at 5 pounds per acre. The Indiangrass was at 3 pounds in the mix. And then little bluestem, it was camper, little bluestem at 2 pounds per acre. That was a combined mix, and it was adjusted for pure live seed. With these, it's very, very fluffy seed. Many of you probably realize that, but it's kind of hard to get it to flow through the planter. So what they did, they halved the seeding rate and just cross-planted it, okay? And they also added a bulk carrier as pelletized lime just to help it flow through the planter better. It ended up working very good, and they had the time to cross-plant it like that, so that helped create a thicker stand as it emerged that first year. It was key to plant it very shallow, okay? Because if you get these things a little bit too deep, you'll never see them come up. So here's the planter in the field. You see the site conditions or the field conditions with the burned down barley. And we're checking seed placement. We're making sure the seed are dropping down those tubes and nothing's clogged up. We're looking at making sure it's the right depth. Everything looked good. They got it planted that day. And then they followed it 10 days later with an application of plateau herbicide at 4 ounces per acre. Now, you can use that on this specific mix, the big blue, Indiangrass, and little blue, okay? And what it did, you can see right here, 2 months later, you can see the emerging native grasses there by the middle of May. Some of them are up a good three, and some of them starting to have the 4th true leaf. So that's really good because we planted it in cold, wet soil there in the middle of March. But as soon as the conditions were right for some of these to germinate, they did. And they sprouted and came on up. But you see there's not a whole lot of competition of weeds around them. And I attribute that specifically to the plateau herbicide that was applied right after that. Now we've reached the 21st of May, so that herbicide at that 4 ounce rate is kind of done its job and it's kind of worn out, okay? So if you fast forward from that point, from May 21 to June 25, or for like 5 weeks later, you can see the native grass has grown out and it's starting to tiller pretty well, okay? This is what a lot of the field looks like. And I was really happy to see that, but you also can tell there's ragweed, there's mare's tail, and some other weeds coming in. Now, when you look out in the broader picture of the field, it's thicker weeds throughout the field, all right? But this is June 25th. For a producer standpoint, if you're not that concerned about the weeds, these weeds are not gonna inhibit this stand from establishing this year, okay? So depending on the producer's philosophy, you can give that another couple of weeks. You can go in and clip it above the seedlings, just clip it off, continue to let the light in, and that stand will come on and fill in and do fine the rest of that year, okay? But the farm manager here at the station, he wasn't gonna have those weeds dropping seed on that research center. So he was determined we were gonna spray it. So they did, and this was June 25th. They came in the next week and sprayed with 12 ounces of Duracor and 0.125 ounces per acre of Cimarron Plus to control those broadleaf weeds. And if you look by August 11th, you can see this field, you don't see any weeds in the field, right? It knocked them out, very clean looking establishment. And I tell you what, you're starting to see a little bit of the seed head of the big blue stem. Now this is August 11th. This was planted on March the 17th. So April, May, June, July. All right, so that's 150 days roughly after planting. It's a beautiful stand, beautiful stand. So one of the points of doing this CIG project is to just demonstrate, if we follow the guidelines or the protocol that was established of how we can do this successfully, be on time and get the seed in the ground when we need to, early enough to catch all those spring rains, control the seedling competition, this is what we could end up with, okay? So there's no special sauce, there's no magic to it. It's just, we followed those agronomic principles, we stayed on time, and this is what we ended up with. And then come August 21st, just 10 days later, you can see more of the field is headed out. Now, a lot of people would want to say, wow, this established so well, I want to capitalize, I want to graze some of this, right? But that's where it really takes self-control, because that first year, you shouldn't go in and graze it, not even easy, not even soft grazing, right? So let those plants established. The first half of that season, they were really putting down a lot of root. They're still growing root systems, but they've put out a lot of vegetation in this case that first year. So it was just good management just to let it go and not try to harvest any of it in any way. So we allowed it to fully senesce, and then later in January, after it had frost killed in November, it had fully gone dormant. At the station, they wanted to clean up the field. They came in and just clipped it. Now, you as a producer, do you need to clip all that biomass down? Absolutely not. It provides a lot of just nesting cover or protective cover rather over the winter for lots of different wildlife. So that gave them time to install fencing for their grazing demonstration that was going to come up the following spring of 21, this year. So at that time, this spring, weather conditions were interesting in Virginia. It's different every year, obviously, but the spring started off cool and the winter was kind of wet, but coming out of that wet winter, it turned off dry, I'd say by April. The temperatures remained relatively cooler than normal on up through May, and it had a kind of extended drought from early April till near the end of May. So the cool conditions really held this back from coming out as early as I thought it would. However, you can see on May 7th, it's greened up well, it's starting to grow vegetatively, and then May 24th, you know, for a stand coming out of the establishment year, going into the first production year, this stand looks good, okay? And we actually, we held a native grass tour there at the research center at this site, and nearly 50 producers came in to look at this who were interested in some of these native grasses. And this is what it looked like. Now you can see there on this slide, as you look, the height of these grasses where Dr. Pent and Dr. Payne are standing, it's up over knee high there on June 8th, okay? This stuff was knee high a week before that, or nearly knee high, and that's really when we should have turned the livestock in to start grazing it, all right? But for one reason or another, research protocols, it didn't happen, and the steers were getting acclimated to their new site, okay? So we had this tour, and it was another 3 days before they put the steers in. And to begin the grazing demonstration, I'll just show you a little bit of this. This 16-acre field was divided into 4 relatively equal-sized paddocks, and the goal was just to document forage growth and animal gains throughout the first grazing season. You can see right here, the 4 paddocks on the right that are outlined, the 100 through 104, is the area that was planted to the natives that they rotated these livestock through. They received the steers from the Shenandoah Valley AREC, ended up putting 20 steers on the native grasses to start with. In the beginning, they ended up taking about 8 of those off after the first grazing rotation, ended with 12 steers during the season. And they had a protocol where they wanted to just graze them on each paddock for about 7 days is what their goal was, their target was. And it says here, or when the forage threshold was reached. They didn't want to take them down too low, obviously, okay? But they stuck pretty close to the 7 days. They weighed the steers after each complete rotation through all 4 of the paddocks. And they took measurements of the forages prior to putting the steers in each of these paddocks. Here they are on the first day, June 11th, going in. You can see they're past belly deep in the lush vegetative native grass mix right there. And like I said, there were 20 that were put in that first paddock for this rotation. Take note now, that's June 11th. 7 days later, look at how fast those grasses grew. And those steers aren't laying down, right? They're standing up, and they're shoulder deep, or all you can see is the ridge of their back and their face above that grass. So, I mean, you know, in hindsight, they waited a little bit too late to put them in, and then another 5 days later, look at what's happened with these steers that have grazed through that paddock. How much of that biomass went through those steers versus what was trampled or left, okay? A whole lot of it was trampled, right? Because they missed that opportunity, that window of capitalizing on all the vegetative biomass because they were delayed in putting them in. It's just a good lesson learned, okay? Now, after they rotated through everything, it had gotten dry again, and it wasn't a whole lot of regrowth on these paddocks from the first grazing rotation, but they went ahead and put them in anyway. We see some regrowth there. They went through, and a lot of the regrowth obviously was vegetative because the big bluestem had seeded out in the first rotation. And but here are some of the numbers. If you look, they made it 3 rotations through these 4 paddocks over the course of the summer. So take note of this. In the first rotation there in the left column, they measured over 3 tons per acre of biomass before turning the steers in, okay? So this stuff had gotten up pretty good. The second rotation, it was only 1/3 of a ton of biomass above that 12-inch grazing stubble height, which is not much, right? It's leafy and vegetative, it's not much biomass. In the third rotation through, it was almost double what it was in the second, but it's still less than 1 ton per acre biomass that was measured, all right? Keep in mind, it's the first production season on these grasses.
Wet biomass or dry matter?
That's dry matter, dry matter. Now, average forage height as it relates to each one of these harvests in the yield estimate here. The first rotation, on average, it was 40 inches high, okay? So if you were in the session yesterday, Dr. Kaiser said you keep these vegetative in between the top of your boot and your hip, okay? But if you keep it in there, then you're gonna be doing okay. But if you let it get 40 inches high, on average, then some of those paddocks before they got to them were 48 inches high or so. So that just helps tell the story as far as what really happened here in this demonstration. The next 2 rotations averaged 16 inches and 26 inches respectively as you got later into the summer. And then if you're looking at steer average daily gain, average daily gain per day, pounds per head per day, you're looking at the first rotation, it was really low of what you would have thought it should have been, at less than a pound per head per day at 0.91. The second rotation, it bumped up to 1.43 pounds per head per day. And then the final one was 1.68, okay? But if you look right there, a whole lot of biomass. It's tall, stemmy, lignified, okay? And we saw in the picture, they didn't eat a lot of that in the first rotation. A lot of it was trampled, and they were looking for leaves, and they weren't eating any stems, right? So it just reiterates the fact that if you're not ready to turn the livestock in when the grasses are ready, then you're going to miss out on some of the opportunity of the potential gains on these weaned animals, right? So don't miss out on that opportunity. So lessons learned, as far as establishment part of the demo goes, start early and completely kill that existing sod if you've got pasture in place where you're going to transition right now. It's great to minimize surface residue. The less surface residue when the planter goes in the field, the higher success rate we see of germination and establishment. From what I'm seeing over the past 3 years, and it showed true in this demo, is that if you get these planted in Virginia, that is, if you get them planted in March to early April, we seem to have a lot of success, especially with this mixture, because we've got the entire season worth of spring and summer rains that are ahead of us. And that just really sets you up for getting a good establishment over the course of the year. And of course, controlling seedling competition. For people who are going to use herbicides, it's a great herbicide combination just to put in there at planting, that imazapic or plateau at 4 ounces per acre, just to give you those 2 months of early season control and get them a head start. I can't tell you how beneficial that is. And then coming back later in the season, scouting it. If you plant it in March, then by June, we're seeing most of the seedlings have reached the 4-leaf stage, and some of them are tillering already. And that's when those seedlings are tough enough. If you had an infestation of a lot of broadleaf weeds, you could come in with other broadleaf pasture herbicides, an assortment of them that are labeled, and go ahead and treat over the top if that's what you wanted to do. But if you can withstand some of those weeds, just clip it once during the growing season just to keep the sunlight on those seedlings, it will come on. So it depends on you know, your potential or what you like. You know, if you can live with the weeds, then just clip them. If you want it clean, then there are products to do it. And of course, do not graze during that first season. As far as grazing management coming into the second year, the first production year, just emphasize, start grazing on time in the late spring. Be ready. You know, it's going to be temperature and moisture dependent each year. It's not going to be the same date on the calendar, right? So you got to be ready. And sometimes where we are in Virginia, our cool season grasses are fescue, orchard grass, and clover. They're pumping in May in most cases. So you gotta say, if I've got these grasses, I'm going to utilize them. Pull a herd or a group of cattle out and put them in on these natives when it's ready. You got to capitalize on it. If you made the investment, the growth is there and the good forage is there. Get in on that early grazing. You definitely want to target to try and stop grazing at about 12 inches, just to leave some leaf area at that stem height. The regrowth points on these natives is on up that stem. So that's where they're going to put out tillers and regrow, or sprouts and regrow again for the second rotation. And so the end of that first true grazing season, it's recommended to probably stop grazing. Don't try and harvest anything after kind of the first week of September. And if you only get 2 rotations through the field that first true production year, then it's probably better that you just focus on getting those 2 rotations, even if it's mid-August, and just not going back in there, okay? A lot of producers I've seen take another pass with their animals. They've made out pretty well with it, but again, the second year after they've been planted, these plants are still expanding their root systems, still getting their feet under them, so to speak. So if you're gonna back off at any time, that second season is the time to probably do it. And it's up to you how these fit into your overall operation. Some people are going to use these just to maintain their dry cow herd over the summer after they've weaned their calves and putting them on something else or sold them off the farm. Other people are going to time it as a fall calving herd. They might wean their calves and put them into these grasses and try to get those 1.5+ pound gains per head per day on that calf crop on this forage. So there's a really good fit for these in Virginia. I'm excited to see over the last 5 years more farmers being open to trying it. I'm excited to see farmers like Bruce Johnson, who you just heard, who has successfully established some and is using them. There's many more like him across the state. So I look forward to working with others over the next several years, or maybe the rest of my career, helping them establish it too. What questions do you have?
What is the soil sample in general look like before y'all plant? Your pHs, you know, were those rough,
The soil fertility on this field was in good shape. It had been in pasture for years at the research center. They had adjusted those when they put it in pasture. The pH was probably at 6, okay? It probably had medium phosphorus and potassium soil test levels. So it was fertilized and limed in the past for cool season production, okay? And that more than met the need for what we were trying to do. Bruce?
One of my questions I was going to ask you about my stand, and I can ask it here in conversation. I have the big bluestem, little bluestem, Indiangrass. I grazed it this summer. I didn't take a late summer or early fall grazing. And it's going to seed. I thought that's good. Let's just let that happen. We might burn in the spring. But currently the seed heads I'm seeing, I believe it's all of that Indiangrass. It's uniform. Did I screw up somehow? Did they lose the missing? Did it seed earlier and I'm not? Am I okay? Or
You're okay. The wonderful thing about that mixture is the big bluestem comes in strong early, and it goes to seed earlier. So all that happened earlier in the summer, and then the Indiangrass comes in and extends that production further into the late summer, fall, and that's why you see predominantly all Indiangrass seed right now.
okay, great.
Yeah. That's right. And selling beef, right? Meat. One more right here.
Did you clip pastures on your way out to get percent use? And you mentioned the number of animals, but what's the stocking rate?
These all right. Did they clip pastures to estimate yield? Is that what your question was?
You had that data, but after you graze on each pasture, did you clip after you get percent?
I wish Dr. Katie Payne was here to give you those details. I think they did clip after the first rotation because you saw so much tall stemmy stuff that was left over if it wasn't trampled. So they did come through and clip after that one. I don't think they clipped after the second pass, okay? And as far as stocking rate, these steers, I believe they averaged somewhere around 5,550 when they came there. So it was 20 of those, okay, put on a 4-acre paddock, okay, for about 7 days. So I'd have to do the math and figure out what that stock density is, but we can do that, okay? Yeah.
We use a lot of natives on our place, and one of the real advantages we find with those is stockpiling those native plants for the winter and not having to deal with any hay. So I'm always wondering how much I should let those cows, when they go dormant and all that energy recedes into the root system, what do you recommend as a kind of a minimum height that you leave behind when you winter?
Okay, so the question was, at the end of the growing season, after the frost hits these natives and they completely go dormant, if you want to put your livestock back in sometime over the winter just to graze those stalks and the fodder and get what they can out of that, is there a target as far as the minimum height you should leave? For the health of the plant, you're not going to hurt it grazing it down pretty close. Because like you say, all the sap is gone out of that plant. It's not going to regrow from those old stalks. In the spring, when it warms up enough, it's going to put out new tillers at the base of those plants. What you're going to have to experiment on your own with is if you take all the residue off the surface, how much of a weed flush is going to come in there from late winter weeds and be a lot of spring weeds because so much sunlight's hitting that soil surface. And is that going to inhibit or slow down the initiation of growth of those warm seasons as it warms up? Okay, so you have to play with that a little bit.
But if you leave 4 inches
Then that's,
above the root crown, you should be all right as far as for the plant.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good question.
One more question. Anyone?
Did anybody do any winter annuals with it, like on very established, very healthy, stay in the meadows?
We have not. This stand has just gotten good and thick now, and they're starting another study looking at some legumes. It's a sub-study in one of these paddocks. But Dr. Kaiser has done some research for his Center for Native Warm Season Grasses. You can go online at that center under the Resources tab and look up some of the publications related to seeding annuals into some of these stands. It's not a, I don't think it's a widely used practice. I'm not sure he had a lot of success with many of them, but it's something you could look at. Whatever you do, if you do try to plant some annuals to graze over the winter in this, you just stay away from things like ryegrass, because it's so thick and persistent and it reseeds itself so bad. It can really thin out this type of stand over time and be more competitive. But that's all I'd say for now on that.
That's what he said as well.
Yeah.
So small grain.
Small grain theoretically would be okay, because it might drop some seed, but it's not going to be nearly as competitive as a ryegrass.
Like using brassica.
I like the idea of using brassicas. I haven't done it, but you know, I can see coming in after that August grazing rotation in Virginia and drilling in 2 to 3 pounds of brassica, whether it's the radish or like rapeseed or something like that. And I think it can come up and start growing in the late summer. And then if everything goes dormant and you end up grazing it in the winter, that's going to be some good high moisture, green, protein-rich material to offset the stalky dry matter. So it might make a good combination.
That isn't grazing too much of that stalking material and keeping your residual life.
True, true.
That's what we actually do, is use those cool seasons as they begin to come on in the winter. Now, this is in Texas, so as they begin to come on in the winter time, and then on into the very early spring before these warm seasons come out, the cool seasons start. You run a rotation through there, clip those off good, and then when these are ready to start, you get a little residual, a little growth, and your cool seasons trying to make that last push to make seed. They put seed down to you next year.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go in there and drill it and keep on with the drilling thing. You can let them go to seed. They're not going to be robust, but they're going to produce some seed for you. They look really good.
So I think you can, like you've done, you've kind of worked out what works for you there, and it sounds like it's a great match. But just the one word of caution, the final word of caution on using annuals in these is let that stand get probably past the second year of full production before you try to do that, because it may thin it out a little bit over time. Okay? All right, thank you very much. Yeah.